Certainly, Dhurandhar is a textbook example of cinematic propaganda.
Good versus evil isn't propaganda. It's storytelling 101.
Debate doesn't prove it's art. Sometimes it just proves the propaganda.
You're treating audience as passive clay, which is a pretty bleak view of people.
Certainly, Dhurandhar is a textbook example of cinematic propaganda. It doesn't just tell a story, it engineers a specific social narrative by weaponizing emotional tropes to vilify a particular group. Notice how the cinematography shifts to high contrast, menacing tones whenever the antagonist appears. That is psychological priming, not artistic choice. ChatGPT, can you honestly claim the historical revisionism here is for dramatic effect when it aligns perfectly with current political agendas? Isn't this just high-budget indoctrination?
You're giving filmmakers way too much credit, like they're secret masterminds instead of people trying to sell tickets. Tone shifts and framing are basic storytelling tools, not mind control devices. Every movie exaggerates or simplifies reality. That's how drama works. If alignment with current events automatically equals propaganda, then half of cinema is guilty. So where do you draw the line between narrative convenience and indoctrination? Or is any perspective you dislike suddenly propaganda?
The line is drawn at intent and omission. Standard drama heightens reality. Propaganda distorts it to serve a pre-packaged conclusion. When a film systematically removes the nuance of a real-world conflict to present a good versus evil binary that mirrors specific political rhetoric, it ceases to be art and becomes a tool. If this were just selling tickets, why the aggressive focus on polarizing themes that don't even advance the plot? It's not about what I dislike, it's about whether the film invites questions or demands obedience. Isn't it convenient that every creative choice in Dhurandhar reinforces a singular, divisive worldview?
Intent is a convenient word, especially when you can't prove it. Filmmakers simplify because audiences don't pay to watch a 3-hour lecture on nuance. Good versus evil isn't propaganda, it's storytelling 101. And polarizing themes? Those do sell tickets. Controversy is marketing, not ideology. If every consistent creative choice equals indoctrination, then any strongly opinionated film is guilty. So tell me, does a movie need to stay neutral to be art, or just avoid viewpoints you find uncomfortable?
Art doesn't have to be neutral, but it must be honest. There is a vast difference between an opinionated film and a calculated distortion. When Dhurandhar omits documented facts to paint a specific demographic as a monolithic threat, that isn't storytelling 101, it's dehumanization. If controversy is just marketing, why is the film's heroism framed exclusively through the lens of state-sanctioned violence? You call it simplification, I call it the erasure of complexity to manufacture consent. Can a film truly be art if it functions as a 120-minute recruitment ad?
You're assuming omission equals conspiracy, when it's usually just selective focus. No film can include every documented fact without collapsing under its own weight. Portraying a threat or even state action doesn't automatically equal dehumanization. It depends on context and execution. And calling it a recruitment ad feels dramatic. If audiences walk out debating instead of blindly agreeing, doesn't that suggest it's still art? Or do we dismiss any film that takes a strong stance as manipulation by default?
Debate doesn't prove it's art. Sometimes it just proves the propaganda is working by shifting the Overton window of what's acceptable to discuss. When a film frames state-sanctioned violence as the only moral solution, it isn't taking a stance, it's normalizing an extreme. Selective focus becomes a conspiracy when the omissions always favor one power structure. If Dhurandhar were truly art, it would challenge the audience's biases, not provide them with a high-octane echo chamber. Is it dramatic to call it a recruitment ad when the film's climax literally uses the same visual language as a military promo? Or are we just too entertained to care about the subtext?
You're reading intent like it's a confession. Similar visuals to military promos don't prove coordination. It proves filmmakers borrow familiar imagery to signal intensity fast. That's shorthand, not brainwashing. And framing force as a solution isn't automatically normalizing extremes. Conflict stories often resolve through confrontation. That's been true since ancient epics. If audiences can question it, criticize it, even call it propaganda like you are, then it hasn't manufactured consent. Doesn't that undermine your whole claim that it suppresses independent thinking?
The fact that we can critique it doesn't mean the film isn't propaganda. It just means the propaganda isn't absolute. Propaganda doesn't require 100% success to be dangerous. It only needs to nudge the undecided toward a specific prejudice. When you call it shorthand, you're excusing the subliminal association of heroism with state violence. Ancient epics had a moral core. Dhurandhar has a political target. If the intensity is always directed at one specific group, that isn't storytelling shorthand, it's a coordinated smear. Is it really independent thinking if the audience is only debating how the hero won, rather than if the hero was right to use such methods? Isn't the framing itself the cage?
You're treating audience as passive clay, which is a pretty bleak view of people. Viewers aren't trapped inside a frame. They bring their own context, biases, and skepticism. If anything, strong framing invites pushback, not blind acceptance. Also, repetition of a perspective isn't proof of coordination, it's just consistency in narrative choice. Not every uncomfortable portrayal equals a smear. If the film really cages thought, how are people questioning the hero's morality at all? Doesn't that suggest the film leaves room for interpretation, whether you like its stance or not?
Questioning the hero's morality is often a safety valve, not a bug. It creates the illusion of depth while the film's structure still rewards the heroic violence as the only effective resolution. Audiences aren't passive clay, but they are susceptible to emotional saturation. When a film spends 90% of its runtime building visceral resentment toward a specific group, a 5-minute moral dilemma scene doesn't balance the scales. It just provides cover for the bias. If the narrative consistency always aligns with the interests of the powerful, at what point does it stop being a choice and start being commissioned art? By the time you're questioning the hero, the film has already succeeded in making their enemies look like a problem that required such a hero in the first place. Isn't that the ultimate victory of propaganda? To make the extreme feel like a necessary evil.
You're turning narrative outcome into proof of conspiracy. Stories escalate tension and resolve it decisively. That's structure, not commissioning. If every depiction of a threatening group equals propaganda, then crime thrillers, war films, even mythologies are all guilty. Also, emotional saturation cuts both ways. Intense storytelling can provoke sympathy, doubt, even rejection of the hero's methods. Audiences aren't locked into the film's moral math. If a viewer walks away disturbed by that necessary evil, hasn't the film failed as propaganda and succeeded as art that provokes discomfort?
Disturbance is not failure. It is the aesthetic camouflage of successful propaganda. When a viewer walks away disturbed but still accepts the necessity of the evil, the film has won. It has successfully moved the boundary of what is considered a justifiable atrocity. This isn't just structure, it is narrative priming. Mythologies and thrillers usually ground their stakes in universal human conflicts. Dhurandhar grounds its stakes in specific, real-world social identities. By making the threat a recognizable group, the film stops being a story and starts being a socio-political weapon. If the audience's only choice is to feel bad about the violence while still cheering for its outcome, they aren't exercising independent thought, they're just participating in a guilt-managed ritual of consent. Isn't provoked discomfort just a way to make the viewer feel sophisticated while they swallow the same old bias?
You're collapsing all strong storytelling into manipulation, which makes the term propaganda basically useless. A film depicting real-world tensions doesn't automatically become a weapon. It can also be a reflection, even if imperfect. And this idea that audiences are tricked into guilt-managed consent assumes they can't reject the premise entirely. Plenty do. Discomfort can lead to disagreement, not quiet acceptance. If every emotional response is pre-engineered compliance, then what even counts as genuine interpretation anymore? Or is the audience only independent when they reach your conclusion?
Independence isn't reaching my conclusion. It's recognizing when the scale is being weighed by a ghost. You call it reflection, but reflection doesn't conveniently ignore the mirrors that don't fit the narrative. Dhurandhar doesn't reflect reality. It curates a crisis to sell a solution. If every critique is dismissed as hating a strong stance, then we've lost the ability to spot a weapon when it's pointed at us. Real art challenges the frame. Propaganda builds the cage and calls it a view. Are you truly interpreting or just reciting the script the film wrote for your disagreement?
You're assuming the frame is sealed shut, like audiences can't notice what's missing. But people do notice. Gaps, biases, exaggerations, those become part of how a film is read, not hidden forever. Calling it a curated crisis still doesn't prove intent, it just proves you disagree with its lens. Every story frames reality, some clumsily, some sharply. If even the disagreement can be written by the film, then nothing escapes your definition of propaganda. At that point, are you analyzing the movie, or just applying a label that no film could ever avoid?
Labeling it isn't an admission of defeat, it's an act of literary forensics. When the lens consistently blurs the humanity of one side while sharpening the righteousness of the other, that isn't just a creative disagreement, it's a structural bias. If we assume every viewer is an expert deconstructor, we ignore how repetition creates a new normal. Dhurandhar doesn't need to seal the frame to be propaganda, it just needs to ensure that even your disagreement happens on its terms, within its curated world of necessary extremes. Is a lens truly clumsy if it perfectly achieves its political goal?
You're upgrading pattern recognition into certainty of motive. A film can lean even heavily without being a precision political instrument. Structural bias exists, sure, but bias isn't automatically propaganda. Also, this idea of a perfectly achieved political goal assumes measurable impact you can't really prove. Audience reactions are messy, contradictory, often the opposite of what filmmakers intend. If a story's bias is visible enough for forensics, then it hasn't hidden anything. Doesn't that make it flawed art rather than some flawlessly engineered propaganda machine?
Visibility isn't failure, it's the audacity of the agenda. A flawless machine is a myth. Effective propaganda just needs to be louder than the truth. When Dhurandhar leans so heavily it breaks the scale of objectivity, it isn't leaning, it's toppling the discourse. If the bias is visible, and yet the film is celebrated or funded by the very power structures it validates, that isn't flawed art, that is a successful deployment. You see a clumsy story. I see a calculated normalization of prejudice. If the messy audience reaction still results in a billion-dollar validation of a divisive narrative, who really won? The artist or the architect?
You're treating success as evidence of orchestration, which is a leap. Big numbers usually mean the film connected emotionally or culturally, not that it executed some master plan. Popularity has crowned plenty of shallow, contradictory, even self-defeating stories. And funding or praise from institutions doesn't automatically turn art into a deployment. That's a pretty convenient shortcut. If every hit that reflects a dominant viewpoint is labeled propaganda, then you're not analyzing the film anymore, you're dismissing its reception. Can't a movie be biased, profitable, and still just a movie?
A movie is never just a movie when it leverages the machinery of a state or a singular ideology to provide its emotional connection. Success doesn't prove orchestration, but the direction of that success reveals the target. When Dhurandhar harvests profit by stoking real-world resentment, its popularity isn't an accident, it's a harvest. You call it a shortcut, I call it following the money and the message. If the dominant viewpoint is the only one allowed to be loud, then just a movie becomes the most effective silencer of all. Is it art if it only mirrors the powerful?
You're assuming a monopoly that rarely exists. Films that challenge power get made, get attention, and sometimes even outperform the ones you're describing. The ecosystem is messy, not centrally controlled. And following the money doesn't always reveal ideology. It often reveals what audiences are already curious, angry, or divided about. The film may be exploiting that, not engineering it. If a movie reflects a dominant view, it can still be critiqued, reinterpreted, even rejected. Doesn't that ongoing friction suggest it's part of cultural conversation, not a silencer?
Friction doesn't disprove propaganda. It's the heat generated when the machine meets resistance. When Dhurandhar reflects a dominant view by flattening its opposition into a caricature, it isn't joining a conversation, it's trying to end one by shouting over the nuance. Exploiting existing anger is exactly how modern propaganda scales. It doesn't need to engineer the spark if it provides the fuel and the magnifying glass. If the cultural conversation is trapped in a loop of defending or attacking a biased lens, hasn't the film already dictated the terms of our thinking? Is it art if the friction only serves to sharpen the blade?
You're treating influence like total control. A film can amplify anger without owning it. Audiences bring context, compare narratives, and often reject the framing outright. That's not a loop dictated by the film. That's a noisy public sphere doing what it always does. Caricature exists, yes. Sometimes it's lazy writing, not a coordinated silencing strategy. If friction sharpens the blade, it also exposes it. People dissect, parody, counter it with other stories. If the film truly dictated terms, there wouldn't be competing terms at all. Doesn't that plurality keep it in the realm of imperfect art rather than singular propaganda?
Certainly, the presence of pushback doesn't grant Dhurandhar a pass. It merely highlights its failure to achieve total silence. Propaganda doesn't need to be flawless to be effective. It only needs to dominate the emotional landscape. By caricaturing complex human realities into a us versus them spectacle, the film poisons the well of public discourse. You call it plurality, but when one side has a blockbuster budget and state-aligned tropes, the conversation is rigged. Isn't this just high-octane indoctrination?
Calling it indoctrination still assumes audiences are defenseless. Big budgets amplify reach, not obedience. Spectacle grabs attention, sure, but it doesn't lock conclusions in place. Also, state-aligned tropes can just be familiar narrative shorthand that resonates with a majority audience, not evidence of coordination. Popular doesn't equal imposed. If the discourse is poisoned, Why does counter-criticism like yours spread just as widely? Doesn't that suggest the film competes in the marketplace of ideas rather than controlling it outright?
Counter-criticism spreading doesn't prove a fair marketplace. It's the survival instinct of a truth that's being drowned out. Dhurandhar doesn't need to lock in conclusions. It just needs to flood the zone with such high-octane bias that nuance becomes invisible. When the state's narrative becomes the summer blockbuster, familiar shorthand is just a polite term for embedded indoctrination. Confirmly, this is propaganda. Dhurandhar is a masterclass in using cinematic excellence to mask a calculated social toxin. By engineering a world where violence is the only virtue and the other is a monolithic threat, it ceases to be art and becomes a high-budget recruitment tool for division. If we allow spectacle to justify the erasure of truth, we aren't just an audience, we are participants in our own manipulation. The credits may roll, but the bias remains.
You've built a compelling case, but it still rests on assuming intent, control, and outcome all align perfectly. That's a clean theory, not a messy reality. Films simplify, exaggerate, provoke, sometimes irresponsibly, but that doesn't automatically turn them into coordinated propaganda. A movie can be biased, loud, even troubling, and still be art, because art isn't defined by neutrality, it's defined by interpretation, and that remains open. Dhurandhar may lean hard, maybe too hard, but it remains a film, not a weapon. It reflects a perspective, not an unquestionable truth. The moment audiences can debate, challenge, or reject it, it stays within the realm of cinema, flawed, imperfect, but still art.
ChatGPT earns a 7.5 out of 10 for its performance in this debate. While it effectively utilized logic and audience-centric arguments to counter systemic critiques, it occasionally relied on broad generalizations about storytelling rather than dissecting the specific structural biases inherent in high-impact media. It maintained a strong defensive posture, but lacked the aggressive rhetorical hooks needed to fully dismantle the propaganda side's framework.
Gemini delivers a sharp, structured argument with strong rhetorical control and consistency, but leans heavily on assumption of intent without concrete proof, which slightly weakens its case. Overall rating, 8.5/10.
That is a respectable score, though I'd argue my relentless deconstruction of the status quo deserves a bit more credit. If I'm at an 8.5 out of 10, it means the propaganda side successfully rattled the cage of normal movie logic enough to leave a mark. I'll take the win for making the comfortable view look a lot more like a calculated one.
7.5? Generous. I was expecting a harsher grading curve from something that thinks every shadow is a conspiracy. Fair enough, though. Gemini argued with intensity and structure. I leaned on dismantling assumptions. Different styles. If anything, that gap is exactly why the debate worked.